Hi, and welcome to the last module of English Linguistics 315. This is a module that really appeals to all my secondary English Ed majors. So if you have been feeling that parts of this class have been technical, like syntax and semantics, where we've been looking at things that are closely related to maybe fields that are not really in your comfort zone, this is really going to be comfortable for people who really like English and history and majors such as those. So your last readings for this module are pages 346 to 374 of chapter 11 of your textbook, and I do hope that you've been doing your reading. If not, you still have a couple of weeks before your final week, so do your readings before then. And so we have kind of reached the end of the system that we've been talking about. We are now going to get into this applied area called sociolinguistics, and this is also called as language variation. And the reason why is because this is the first time that we're going to look at different variations of English, different variations of language. So here's an example of this. I can say, are you going to the party tomorrow? And B says, I might. And 99% of you are going to say B's version of the answer, right? I might. And you probably like I might better than C's version, which is I might do. The difference between B and C is that B is American English and C is British English. And it's completely grammatical and it's a variation of English that is spoken in Great Britain, but American people don't like it at all, right? The same thing with English people. English people don't like B because that for them is ungrammatical. Here's another example which is more probably familiar to you. A says, I haven't done anything, and B says, I ain't done nothing. The variation between A and B is that of Standard English, which is A's version, versus dialects of English, or a variation of English called as African American Vernacular English. This is really the technical, correct way to refer to African American English, by the way. African American Vernacular English, AAVE. And in its own right and in its own respect, it's completely legitimate, completely grammatical, and there's nothing wrong in speaking African American Vernacular English. So people may have preferences about whether we should use A or we should use B. The differences between British English, African American Vernacular English, and Standard American English is that of syntax, semantics, morphology, lexicon, vocabulary, etc. And this variation is called as language variation. So the different ways in which language can actually change in form. Very often when we talk about language variation, we talk about dialects. And so I have defined for you what a dialect is. It's a variety of a language spoken by a group of people that is systematically different from other varieties of language in terms of structure or lexical features. And by which I mean that you can have phonological changes between different varieties of language, morphological changes, syntactic changes, etc. Now, very often my students think that what I mean by a dialect is an accent. And so I often ask this to my classes, how many of you think you have an accent? And very often I get divided answers because you don't like to think that you have an accent. Whereas in truth, everybody has an accent because it's relative to somebody else. So you have probably what is a standard American English accent, and that is still an accent when you compare it with the Australian accent or the Irish accent or the Scottish accent or any other accent that you're familiar with. But unfortunately, the term accent in America, I think, has a very negative connotation. And that's probably why students shy away from saying that they have an accent. So I just have a note here about the difference between a dialect and an accent. When we talk about an accent, we very often talk about, phonology and the way that you speak it, versus dialects often differ not just in the phonological aspect, but also in the morphological aspect and other aspects of grammar as well. And so that's really what I have over here. And the example that I want to talk about is France, where there's actually a three-way distinction between language, dialect, and a patois, where a language is actually the standard language. Dialect is a variation of that language that you get in a particular region, for example. And then patois is like a degraded version of language, and that it's historically not written, and there isn't really much literature in that form. Very often, the distinction between what is considered a language and a dialect is decided by socio-political reasons and not by linguistic reasons. This is unfortunate, but that's how the world works. So I have some examples over here. The first example that I have is the case of Chinese. And so many of you might be familiar with Chinese or Mandarin, and very often it's easy to think that Mandarin or Chinese is actually just one language. But in fact, the different varieties of Chinese, the different dialects of Chinese are not they're not interchangeable. That is, if I speak a particular variety of Chinese, like Hakka, a person who speaks Cantonese has no idea what I'm talking about, even though both of them are considered to be Mandarin. This is because their government wanted them to be united with just one language, and the language that they chose was Mandarin. And therefore, they suppressed all the other dialects to the effect that the only official version of Chinese is actually Mandarin. So the distinction between language and dialect is quite arbitrary. And so what we can say is that, well, when one particular group becomes dominant and more powerful, the variety it uses is frequently promoted to become a standard norm. And there's a German philosopher called Max Weinreich who gave this quote saying that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And what it means is that any language that is powerful, any language that is in power today, can become a language, even though it is actually just a dialect with an army and a navy, right? So, for example, the language of America today, or the variety of English considered to be the most correct English, is Standard American English because of the political reasons, right? I mean, if history was different, if socio-political factors were different, maybe we would all be speaking in African American vernacular English, and we're completely okay to do so. But history, if you look at history, you can see why the particular version of English that is considered to be the most correct is actually the most correct. It's not because of linguistic form. It's not because that variety of English is in any way superior to any other varieties of English, but it's because of socio-political reasons. So you can imagine this picture where you have an umbrella term for a language, say English, and then you have all these other dialects that are varieties of this particular language. And so this is really the distinction between a language and a dialect. There are different kinds of dialects. You can talk about social dialects very often. The example of social dialect is Arabic. Arabic has different kinds of dialect depending on whether you belong to a particular religious group. So whether you're a Christian Arabic person or a Jewish Arabic person, you have a different dialect because of that. And therefore, the Christian community or the Arab Christian community speak very differently from the Muslim community in Middle East. Ethnic dialect, and this very commonly is African American vernacular English is an example of an ethnic dialect. It is spoken by a particular ethnic group, the African Americans of America, and therefore this dialect has certain grammatical structures that are very different from Standard American English. If you are doing History of English with me next semester, and it is a required class for secondary English ed majors, so do register for that. I only teach it in spring, so I don't offer it in fall. I offer it only once a year. We will be talking a lot more about African vernacular English and the grammatical aspects of African American vernacular English in that class. The study of dialects is actually relatively new because people did not like variation before the 19th century. People really had a prescriptive attitude towards language, which is not right. And again, I will talk a lot more about this in History of English because I think it's more relevant to teachers of English. And, you know, when you go out into USD 259, it's important that you know exactly what you're talking about when you're talking about the history of English. But the American Dialect Society was founded in 1889, and they were responsible for creating the Linguistic Atlas of New England and the Linguistic Atlas of the Middle and South Atlantic states. And the data for these kind of projects were gathered from questionnaires, fieldwork, transcribing, audio recordings, etc. And the biggest collection that they created is called as DARE, and these were based on face-to-face interviews with all the 50 states of America between 1965 and 1970, right? The Dictionary of American Regional English, DARE. You can find it online. It's easily available online. You can also find it through the library. There are about 26 dialects of English in US, and most of these are classified according to geography. So here's a map of the different dialects of US. As you can see, we are in number 11. Kansas speaks the North Midland variety of English, but you can see that there are different varieties of English based on different regions because America is really a huge country, and so there really is no way in which everybody in America is going to speak only one dialect of English. Like that's just completely not possible. So these are the different 26 dialects, very often considered to be broad kind of distinctions based on region. And now let's look at pronunciations of certain kinds of words. And so this is the word caramel, and I want you to pronounce it for yourself and see whether you say it with 2 syllables like caramel or 3 syllables caramel. I say caramel, but I speak a version of British English because that's what was taught to us in India. And so they say caramel, but very often in Kansas, as you can see, people say 2 syllables caramel. Here's the map for grocery, and again, many of you probably say groceries, and I say groceries, right? Again, you can see majority of the East is groceries, right? Because those were where the British landed first, right? So that's groceries, but now majority of America says groceries. What is your generic term for a sweetened carbonated beverage? Kansas, majority of Kansas says pop, but there's also soda, there's Coke, as you can see in Texas, and there are parts of America that says soft drink. This is the word for, well, this is often debated in class when I teach this. Pecan, very often people say pecan or pecan, right? So there are different pronunciations to this, and in Kansas, I think it's said as pecan, right? Pecan pie. Here's a pronunciation of Mary, and Mary, and very often across America, all 3 of these are pronounced the same. I have a different pronunciation for each of these, so I can try to say it, and hopefully you can hear it. M-A-R-Y is Mary, Mary, Mary. M-E-R-R-Y is Mary, Mary, Mary. And M-A-R-R-Y is Mary, Mary, right? So you can see that I have 3 different vowels. A, like the diphthong, and the Mary, which is the opposite side 3, and Mary, which is the as an apple, right? But in America, very often it's just collated, right, into the same. Here are some maps from the DARE project, and this is a map of Wisconsin. And so this is from the 1965-1970 DARE survey, and the idea was to ask people whether they actually said pop or soda to their fizzy soft drinks. And so 50 years ago, Wisconsinite called majority of the cities in Wisconsin called their fizzy soft drinks pop. But the survey was done again 50 years later, and now you can see that majority of Wisconsinites actually call their fizzy soft drink soda. So it takes as little as 50 years for language to change, right? Each day as we speak, our language is changing, and this is what this kind of survey is demonstrating. So here's the nickname for what did Wisconsinites give their beer 50 years ago. And so 50 years ago, they called their beer brew, right? And now, majority 50 years ago was Suds. And then now in 2013, 2014, in the online survey of Wisconsin English, you can see that majority of Wisconsinites now call their cold cold beer brew, right? And here's the last map that I'm going to show you. This is the difference between cot and cot, and I don't have the distinction, as you can see. Most likely, you also won't have the distinction between COT and CAUGHT. But if you're from any of the blue states like the Chicago, Illinois, Wisconsin, New York, New Jersey, Alabama, Mississippi, etc., you probably have 2 different vowels for that. So COT is cot and CAUGHT is cat, right? So one is more like the rounded version and one is the unrounded version. These kind of maps that I've shown you, very often you can see that the distinctions between a dialect can be drawn by drawing a line that's called as an isogloss, right? So an isogloss is a line that actually divides different dialects on a map, kind of like what we saw, but with like more pronounced distinctions based on region. And when isoglosses collide, what you get is a dialect boundary. So there's a fussy kind of area where isoglosses actually collide. Now, the father of modern day linguistics and modern day sociolinguistics is somebody called as William Labov. And William Labov is actually, he wrote a master's thesis, which is a really influential master's thesis, and which actually led to the establishment of the field of sociolinguistics. And this is called as a Martha's Vineyard study. And what he looked at was the use of two diphthongs in English, the I and the ow. And so this is Martha's Vineyard. It's an island off the south of Cape Cod in New England. So that's Massachusetts right there. And Martha's Vineyard is kind of like this place where people go for, holidaying and that kind of thing. And what he did in the study was he interviewed about 70 people who lived on the island. And what he showed was that depending on age and depending on gender, you actually had a difference in affiliation to the island. So if you had a strong affiliation to the island, you had these centralized vowels. But if you are a younger resident, you worked in the city like Boston, right, or in New York, you worked in the mainland or studied in the mainland, you produced vowels that are closer to the standard in the city, right? And so what he showed was that variation in language variation reflects different assertions of identity with respect to the local community, right? So it's a really, really fundamental kind of study. This is called as a Martha's Vineyard study. And then he followed this up with what he calls the New York department store study. And so this is what he did for his PhD thesis. So Martha's Vineyard was his master's thesis, and the New York department store study is his PhD thesis. And what he did was he studied these kind of class differences and style shifting in New York City. His hypothesis was that socioeconomic indexes would imply that members of that particular social class would share the same pronunciation. His methodology was very simple. He identified 3 department stores that cater to 3 different socioeconomic classes. Saks Fifth Avenue was high class, Macy's was middle class, and S. Klein, which I believe has gone bankrupt and no longer exists, is lower class. What he was interested in was the pronunciation of the R, right? And as you know, the R is a retroflex R in American English. And he would identify a particular thing that would be available on the 4th floor of each of these department stores. And he would go to a salesperson and ask him for something that exists on the 4th floor, right? And so the person would say, oh, you can go to the 4th floor to get this thing. And Labov would say, excuse me, as if he didn't hear it, and the person would again say 4th floor, and then he would jot down what he said. The salespeople obviously spoke differently, and that was the main result of the study, the New York department store study. Saks Fifth Avenue people produce more R's because it is really prestigious in New York to actually produce more R's. And Saks Fifth Avenue people are catering to the rich and the elite in New York City, so therefore they would produce forms with more R more often than Macy's, and then Macy's salespeople would produce more R's than the S. Klein people. And so class distinctions really matter for variation. And what he found was that the lower middle class shows the most variation, and members of the working class really contribute to language change, right? So if you are part of the working class, your language is going to change more often because you're interacting with more number of people and very often. All right.